afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. Dairy products like milk, cheese, and ice cream purchased and consumed in New England are mostly made from milk that comes from dairy farms in the Northeast. Scientists and researchers informally refer to this grouping as the New England milk shed. As animal diseases like bird flu continue to pop up in the headlines, it becomes critical that farmers, processors, and the public understand how to protect farms and communities from experiencing an outbreak. UVM is hosting an online workshop for dairy farmers, producers, and industry allies, drawing the line in New England Milk Shed, Regional Zoning for Dairy Industry Preparedness Workshop. It happens March 27th, and we'll have more information throughout today's discussion with our guest, Dr. Julie Smith. She's a veterinarian and research professor at the UVM Department of Animal Veterinary Services, and you lead the regionalization project that collaborates with dairy farmers, dairy cooperatives, veterinarians, federal and state regulators. You got a lot of people in your phone book, I bet. And thank you for joining us today.
Pleased to be here.
And you actually brought with you a video, and we're going to share it in just a second, which kind of explains the ways that officials quarantine farms if there is a disease, which we've been seeing, like we mentioned before, in the headlines. But before we show the video, we want to know a little bit about you. So can you define the term milk shed and talk a little bit about your work around that?
Sure, Julie. So the milk shed concept is pretty simple. So most people are familiar with what a watershed is. So in a watershed, you have sources of water that are coming from a land area and they're going into the tributaries and streams that go into a larger body of water, whether that's a river or a lake. So it's a similar concept with the milk shed, that I'm thinking in terms of all of the sources of milk, all of the dairy farms where milk is being produced, and where that milk then goes for processing. So all of the milk that comes into New England for processing is part of that milk shed, whether it's produced by cows in New England or maybe in New York State. And so I think it's really important to think about these movements of milk within the milk shed, because the milk is crossing state borders all the time, almost as if they don't exist. And that's a really important, means that it's really important for us to think about emergency disease preparedness with that whole region in mind.
All right, we'll play that video in just a second, but first talk about how your work is really important to kind of preparing for stuff like that.
Well, we're really want to make sure that we have a quick and coordinated response. And so having everyone who's part of the response, from the response authorities and the state and federal veterinarians to the producers themselves in their communities, aware of what would happen is really important. And that's why we're doing this project.
All right, we've teased it twice now, but we've got a video explaining some of the nitty-gritty of this. Take a look.
During a foreign animal disease outbreak, animal health officials place farms or ranches with known infected animals under quarantine and establish control areas around them. The movement of susceptible animals is restricted inside these areas to try and stop the spread of disease. However, these restrictions also interfere with normal business operations. A control area includes the central infected zone and a surrounding buffer zone. Its borders are determined by officials and can vary based on the type of disease outbreak and the likelihood of spread. Usually, controlled areas are defined by landmarks such as county borders, highways, or rivers. Farm operators may need to get a permit to move any animals, semen, embryos, milk, manure, and other animal products inside a control area. To get a permit, they would need to prove that they are tracking the movement of animals and animal products, implementing biosecurity or disease control measures, and getting test results or inspecting animals for signs of disease. Farm operators can find guidance on how to meet permit requirements in the secure food supply plans developed for each food animal species. During a foreign animal disease emergency, federal and state veterinarians will create situation-specific requirements, which could change as an outbreak continues and more information becomes available. Some continuity of business may be possible for farms and ranches inside a control area that are not infected and can meet state-specified requirements. However, support for farms and ranches will be limited during a foreign animal disease emergency, so it's important to be familiar with and ready to use enhanced biosecurity practices before an outbreak happens. That way, farm operators can quickly activate alternate plans that will allow them to continue shipping animals or animal products. Large-scale animal disease outbreaks can affect the food supply chain. If access to export markets is lost or consumer demand drops, a surplus of agricultural products can result in a steep drop in farm gate prices. That's why animal health officials work with industry partners to try and minimize the negative effects of a disease outbreak, while also containing and eradicating the disease. By being ready to recognize and report signs of disease and quickly implement enhanced biosecurity measures, farm producers can reduce the potential for harmful impacts on their animals, businesses, and communities.
And as we just saw, there's a lot of work that goes into putting up these quarantines and these barriers, and that doesn't just happen overnight. So what kind of preparedness do we practice in New England to be ready for that?
Right, so obviously the state and federal veterinarians are ready. They're ready to get started and quarantine any infected premises, make sure that they're managing control areas, because their goal is to find the disease fast, contain it, and keep it from spreading. And on the same side, all the affected livestock industries would be doing the same thing. And so we'd have farmers who would be really trying to ramp up their ability to do those things themselves, to be able to find disease fast, keep it out, keep it from spreading. They'd have to be, observing their animals, getting test results, managing and tracking movements of things, cleaning and disinfecting vehicles, making sure that there were more practices for people coming on the farm. Restricting access is actually a really important part of that. And it's more than just the farms too, right? So it's the farms, people on the farms, and the milk haulers and the receiving plants themselves are all part of the process for the dairy industry that would have to be working together to control a disease if it got into the cow animal system.
And so we're talking about the Northeast kind of dairy watershed, as we said before. So is there a regional response as well on that broad level?
Well, it's really important for New England states to think about response cooperatively, because each state is really quite small. Vermont is a small state, 45 out of 50 in terms of size, and you take all of New England together, and then it's more like the size of an average state, somewhere between the size of Washington State and North Dakota. If milk is moving across state borders every day, as if the borders don't exist, so that's the reality, but state authorities, when there's a disease response, the state authorities are limited by the boundaries of the state. It's really important for those state authorities to work together, right, so that we can have a coordinated response and the milk can, as much as possible, keep moving across those state lines for processing. And I'll bring us back to Vermont, because Vermont is, the dairy industry is the #1 agricultural sector in the state, and Vermont actually sends quite a bit of milk to other states for processing, so maybe it's half of what we produce. But Vermont's producing a lot of milk every day. So the cows are producing 6 million pounds of milk a day. Maybe that sounds like a lot. 700,000 gallons, maybe hard to picture. Think of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It almost fits in the pool.
Wow.
So every day, Vermont's cows are essentially filling an Olympic-sized pool with milk. If something happened and it was hard to get the milk to processing, the concern is what would happen. So it's really important that we have plans that are ready to go so we can keep as much milk as possible moving.
And we've talked about disease kind of hypothetically, but tell me, what specifically are we worried about?
Right, so there are different types of emergency diseases. Like, we frame our projects around emergency diseases, and that just means a disease where it would trigger a response by the veterinary services of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And these diseases could be new diseases, so those are emerging diseases, or they could be diseases that are already considered by the United States foreign animal diseases, or diseases that don't normally occur in animals in this country.
Sure. Does that include bird flu in this case?
Right, so bird
not
flu,
to spoil it.
bird flu is actually an example of both, right? So bird flu, which is right now, we're dealing with strains, a particular strain called H5N1 of the highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. And that is considered a foreign animal disease of poultry. But recently, the virus got into cows, where it's considered an emerging disease. So there we have an example of both. But my project is not concerned with bird flu, but another virus that can affect multiple livestock species, all of the species that have cloven hooves. So it's all of our cows, beef and dairy cows, pigs, and small ruminants, so sheep and goats, and other cloven-hooved animals, whether they're domestic or wild. And so I'm talking about the foot and mouth disease virus, also called hoof and mouth disease, because of where the clinical signs are most commonly seen.
Sure. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to make sure we talk about the event coming up on March 27th. Do you mind quickly telling me about that workshop?
Sure. So we are bringing together stakeholders in the dairy industry, so both dairy farmers and dairy cooperative staff and state and federal veterinarians, because they all have different perspectives on how a response should go. They have different decision frames, different resource constraints, and we want to bring them together to think about regionalizing the response. Could we basically draw a line, so this is the name of the workshop, drawing a line in the New England milkshed, draw a line around this milkshed area, especially if we are free of disease, and possibly give us the opportunity to reestablish trade, which is one of the things that would be impacted by a foreign animal disease. And if we can have an opportunity to reestablish trade, that would help market our dairy products in the region and across the country.
And who's funding it?
So we couldn't do this without funding from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program. And just quick disclaimer, all of the work that comes out of this project should not be taken as any official policy or declaration of the U.S. government.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
In Drawing the Line in the New England Milkshed, Regional Zoning for Dairy Industry Preparedness Workshop. It happens March 27th from 10 to 3. The workshop is online, so you'll need to sign up at the website on your screen. And I want to thank the crew from WCAX for all of their hard work and dedication to our program. I'm Jolie Whitney. This is Across the Fence. Have a good one.